Hello and welcome back. I'm your host, Jerry Mateo. And in this chapter, I'm going to be showing you how you can use all of the things I've showed you in all of the past chapters in order to mix this multi-track recording that I have here. We are going to be primarily focusing on the drums because these are multi-track drums, so we're able to utilize the phase rotation section inside of the Evo channel to really take a look at how it works and why it's something you should use. So without any further delay, I'm going to just play the song that we're going to be taking a look at so you can be familiar with what it sounds like and the style of music it's going to be in. This is a track I wrote and recorded for this specific demo, so it's only about a minute long. Let's take a listen to it. Cool, so it's a very short, very simple little orchestration. We simply just have the easy keys over here printed down. We have a stereo acoustic guitar recording, a bass track, and then we have our multi-track drums. The drums are pretty straightforward. It is a kick drum, snare top, snare bottom, hi-hat, floor tom, and then we have 3 stereo recordings, which is the overheads, the ambient microphones, and then the drum reverb. This is pretty standard for how I like to do things. The kick is a Sennheiser kick mic placed inside of the sound hole. The snare top and bottoms are, I believe, a 57 and an SM81 at the bottom. The hi-hat mic is a SM87. Floor tom is a Sennheiser 421. And the overheads are a pair of Sennheiser MK4s. The ambient mic is going to be a pair of ribbon mics that are basically located on the hallway outside of the drum room. And this is pretty standard. It's just because the drum room itself didn't have that much reverb because it was a very tight room. So we just had this out in the hallway to capture an ambient sound. The drum reverb is actually a cheap little Lexicon reverb unit that is being fed all of the drum tracks, or most of them at least, and then printed down back into Studio One. So with all of that said, let's take a quick listen to the drums so we can see what they sound like by themselves. So here we go. So they sound pretty good. This is a decent recording, but there are a couple of things that I'm not really happy with. I find that the kick mic that I have is actually very, very good if you're doing rock and metal, but for something very ballad-like this song, it's kind of sounding a little bit too upfront, a little bit too high-end heavy, and a little bit too snappy. Let me solo this up so you can hear this. And then in the mix, you can really hear it. You can hear the upper harmonics of the kick mic just slapping you in the face. Now for a rock song or a metal song, that's perfect because you want it to really cut through the mix. But for something like this, we want to dampen this down. Now, the next part we want to take a listen to are the snare top and bottom mics, and that's because we want to make sure that they are in phase. One thing that you always want to do is make sure that you invert the polarity of the snare bottom mic because it's going to be picking up the signal opposite of the snare top. So what I'm going to do is just activate one of these Evo channels and invert the phase to check the phase for these two mics. That sounds pretty good. Let's invert the phase. So right off the bat, you can tell that this is indeed in phase. When I invert the phase, it completely kills all of the low end. Another really cool thing is if you use the phase button and you group these snare tracks, you can actually rotate the phase of them until you find the perfect phase alignment. This way you can actually get the exact amount of phase correction that you need. It's not the same thing as just doing a simple inversion. It actually rotates it very slowly and very smoothly. So let me show you what this will sound like. I'll grab the Evo channel on this one and put this into group 1. And let me show you what happens when I rotate the phase. You'll notice that the closer I get to the center or no phase changes, it sounds a lot fuller. And that's because this was recorded very, very well. But I do notice that sometimes when I'm around 30 to 40, I get a little bit more low end bite. And when I'm all the way to 180, it's completely out of phase like it would be if I did the phase inversion. So this is a very cool tool to utilize. Now for this particular setup, what we're going to be doing is going back to the phase section after we've mixed all the tracks. That way we don't have to worry about using EQ and compression and suddenly being out of phase with everything we've just fixed. Now after this, let's take a listen to the hi-hat mic. This is simply just a mono hi-hat mic. So that's good. And then let's take a listen to the floor tom. This was only really hit, I believe, one time, and that's right around here. It's a pretty flubby sounding floor tom, so that's something we might need to fix. And then let's listen to the overheads. That's a good tight sounding room mic. And then we have the drum ambient mic. Pretty good. I love drum ambient mics. I suggest using them whenever you get a chance. And then last we have the cheap Lexicon reverb unit. You can really hear that like cheap Lexicon reverb unit sound on the high frequencies, but it sounds pretty cool. Since we now have an idea of what the kit sounds like, let's work on mixing it. The first thing I'm going to do is save my session and solo up the kick drum. I'm going to find a place where it's playing quite a bit, and now I'm going to show you how I go about tuning the EQ frequencies and everything like that. Let's take a listen to just the kick. Now, if you look at the analyzer, we see quite a bit of spikes in about 2K to 5K. And that's probably because these are the frequencies that I'm hearing are a little bit too bitey. So I'm going to smooth this out just to see if it still looks like that. You can see that that's pinpointed it pretty well. Let me see if I make it super sharp, if I can get an exact frequency measurement. It looks like that's pretty much where it is. It's a little bit too aggressive right there, so I'm just going to do about a 4 or 5 decibel cut, and I'm going to extend the frequency range by lowering the Q a little bit. Pretty good. Okay, I'm just going to hit shift and bring this back down a little bit. I don't want to be too aggressive. And now we're going to find a frequency that's sounding a little bit too flubby. So we're going to tighten up the Q, and here we go. So that's sounding pretty good. Let's bypass the equalizer to see if we need to do any changes. That sounds really good. Now I want to add a little bit of lift to the lower frequencies, nowhere higher than about 100 hertz. And then we'll utilize a little bit of a high pass filter in order to tighten up the very, very low end. I'm going to hold control and scroll up to make this have a 12 dB octave slope. And we'll try it at about 39 hertz. Let's bypass it. That sounds a lot rounder, and that sounds like it's going to fit a ballad performance a lot better. I'm going to increase the output gain by just a dB and a half. That way it has the same amount of gain, and let's take a listen to it in the mix. Let's bypass it. So it has a much rounder sound. Now I'm going to move on to the compressor section because now I want to have a little bit more of an aggressive sound to it now that I've tamed it out. This is a great way of kind of shaping the overall tone of it. I use the EQ to correct any problems, and now I'm going to use the compressor to add back some of that aggression. I'm going to set this to kick and snare mode, and let's see what this sounds like just in the initial starting position. I'm going to bring down the makeup gain by quite a bit because I don't think we need to increase it by 9 decibels. Now you can hear how aggressive this sounds. Let's see what happens if I bring down the attack and then bring it back up. And now let's increase it. You can almost hear it bringing up the tail or the slapback of the room when I do this. So let's see if we adjust the release, what happens. That sounds pretty cool, actually. I'm going to bring down the ratio because I don't want to have that much compression, and bring up the threshold. And then I'm going to use the makeup gain accordingly. Let's bypass it. Cool. I'm going to bring down the makeup gain, and let's take this out of solo. Now, the next thing I want to do is solo up the drum kit once again and see if this is in or out of phase. I'm getting a little bit more bottom end when I flip the phase or invert the phase, which means that we have done quite a bit of changing to the frequency response and the phase coherence. This is where later on using the phase section is going to really help dial it in and get it really, really tight and bang on. Now after this, let's move on to the snare top and bottom. And I like to do something a little bit interesting for this. I tend to pack these into a folder and then create a bus channel for this and name this snare sum. I'm going to color it the same red, but I'm also going to make sure that the output of this channel is going to the same drum bus. This way I have my balance of my snares pretty much spot on, and all I have to do is utilize a Evo channel to mix this up in. So let's take a listen to the snares. Now these sound really, really good on their own. Let's see what happens if we add some drive. Bypass it. It's just a subtle hint of body. Let's try it right here. You just gain a little bit more excitement. So I'm going to bring this down to about 70%. And now let's focus on getting rid of some unwanted frequencies. I'm hearing a couple of resonant frequencies that I don't like. So I'm just going to increase the Q and raise this up. Here we go. That's tightened it up quite a bit. Now let's get rid of some more resonances in the lower mid-range. Cool. After this, I'm going to use just a little bit of a high pass just to get rid of anything under about 50 or 60 hertz. And now I'm going to utilize something a little bit different. I'm going to have the compressor again, but I'm going to set it to kick snare. And right away, I'm going to peg this because I want to use parallel compression. Now that sounds really crazy. Let's set it to 0% wet. Let's find a nice balance. Bypass the plugin. That's really cool because we've added a lot of excitement and we're only using about 45% of the original mix. Next, we're going to go to the touch and let's tighten this up a little bit. Let's remove some of the reverb. We're going to set this to sustain killer. You can hear that like kind of gated reverb sound. Let's increase the release. There we go. That's gotten rid of some of the excess ring, and I'm liking that. Let's take a listen to that in the mix. So that sounds pretty good. Let's move on to the hi-hats. Now this is pretty simple. I'm just going to go to a section where it's playing and get rid of unwanted low end. And then I'm just going to bring down a little bit of the sizzly high end. And we can use the touch control to give me a little bit of de-essing if we want. But for this, I would do full band just because if you do a split band, it's automatically going to cause phase issues. Bypass it. Very subtle. I'm going to increase the drive and then do a little bit of output gain. It just has a little bit more warmth. Very subtle, but it's there. Next is the big problem, the tom. I don't like the tom. I don't think it sounds very good. So right off the bat, we can see the resonant frequencies. You can hear and see that the lower frequency kind of resonates and then goes down, meaning that it wasn't tuned or tightened up well enough. I do kind of like it though. It does sound pretty natural, so I'm just going to tighten up the low end a little bit just by getting rid of maybe something under 50 hertz or so. And then getting rid of the kick drum sound from the tom. And then we can use the shelf to lift up that low end resonance. Then we can add just a little bit of smack. Cool. We'll have some drive and let's mess around with the touch to create a little bit more impact. Let's try the transient boost and let's aim for just the low end. Right there. We increase the amount by about 18% and increase the release to about 100. Right off the bat, that sounds way better. Let's bypass it and back on. But we are gaining a little bit too much volume, so let's just bring this down. Bypass and back on. It's subtle, but it's actually a little bit more aggressive and it kind of cuts through a little bit more. Just going to bring up my output gain by about a dB. And let's move on to the overheads. Now, I actually think this sounds pretty good. Let's just get rid of some unwanted muddiness. Let's make the analyzer nice and big, and then we'll sharpen up the analyzer. Cool, that sounds pretty good. Next, we'll go to the drum ambient. Now for this, I'm going to utilize the sustain killer. And let's see if we can get some cool effect out of this instead of just taming something. Let's get some weird sounds out of this. Let's try the transient killer. Bypass it. Honestly, I really like this. This sounds interesting. Let's see how this sounds with the entire drum kit. We'll bring up the output. Bypass it. It just has this subtle sense of space to it. I actually really dig it. It's not really using it conventionally, but now we can use the EQ to kind of shape it a little bit better. Cool, so now what we've done is we've basically made this sound like a ambient reverb mic instead of a drum room mic. Let's take a listen to a bypass. And with it on. It just has a much more papery, kind of crazy, distorted sound. We'll just input the drive. Pretty cool. Now we're going to go to the reverb mic, solo this up. Right off the bat, we're going to cut off some high end. And we'll cut some low end. And now let's find some resonant frequencies that we might not want. We'll make this nice and sharp. And here we go. Now this sounds a little crazy, right? We've kind of really darkened it up and we've just made it sound like a big mess of low end. But let's bypass it and turn it back on. Pretty cool, right? In the mix, this is actually going to help it have a much more aggressive sound because now we can have more of it without it sounding really harsh in the higher frequencies. So we're just going to bring up the output gain. Bypass it. Back on. And a cool thing is now that it doesn't get in the way, we can bring this up in the mix. And with the Evo channel bypassed. It just has a more analog style sound to it. It's a little bit less aggressive and you're able to fit more in without it sounding like you have too much reverb. I do have the output cranked quite a bit, so we're going to bring this down. So what I want to do now is see if we can mimic a gated reverb sound. We'll go to the sustain killer, turn it up all the way, and let's see what we can do. Let's take a listen. And we'll bypass it. Now, it's a very subtle change, but what we've done is we've made it sound a lot warmer. So now what I want to do is we'll solo up these drum mics and see what it sounds like with all of these Evo channels turned on, and then we're going to bypass them. So here we go. And bypass. You hear the high end kind of just fluttering everywhere. It kind of gets in the way. It doesn't sound as tight or as professional, but with it on, it has a much rounder sound and it even fits in a little bit nicer. It doesn't have this artificial high end kind of going on. We've tamed all these unwanted resonances from that room. So with that done, I think the last thing we need to do for these drums is activate the phase. We're just going to make sure that every single one of them is turned on. And we set them all to group 1. Now what I want to do is have these all soloed up and dial in the phase of the kick drum. Right there, we have a little bit more low end. Let's bypass it. And with the phase on. It just has the subtlest amount of low end beefiness added back in. Let's try the snare. Pretty cool. I think that's it. That sounds really good now. Let's bypass them again. And back on. Cool. So now what I want to do is have this in the mix with all the Evo channels on, and then we will bypass them to see if what we've done is better or worse. So we're going to start with them on. And on. The kick drum right away sounds a lot fuller, a lot more upfront, a lot more in your face, but also a lot tamer, which is really interesting. It sounds like it has more impact, even though a lot of the higher frequencies that usually give it impact are now taken away. So with that done, we've pretty much mixed the drums very quickly and in pretty much real time. This sounds way better, it fits in a lot nicer, and this was done in a relatively short amount of time with almost no real effort. These EQ bands are very nice and smooth. The touch feature is really a powerful tool because instead of having to add a de-esser, I just activate the de-esser module, put it on the hi-hats, put it on the overheads, and we're good to go. So with that said, that's going to be it for this chapter. Stay tuned because in the next chapter, I'm going to show you how we can mix the bass, guitar, and piano for this song. This is Jerry Mateo, and I'll see you next time.